And we are broadcasting, and we now welcome Dr Hilton and colleagues from CSIRO. Dr Hilton, I see you've got an opening statement for us. Would you like to speak to it?
Senator, if you'd like me to speak to it, I'd be delighted, but I'm also happy if it's tabled. Your call.
We'd be happy to have a few highlights from your opening statement if you're prepared to do so. That
would be a pleasure. Science has never been more important to Australia. We face profound challenges that become increasingly urgent and complex. And when we think about those challenges, it is the energy transition, climate change, ensuring our security, tackling biodiversity loss, supporting health and wellbeing of Australians. All of those challenges require us as a nation to be able to do great science and trust in it. Our research in these critical areas faces criticism from time to time, and I welcome this. Rigorous conversation should be encouraged as a pillar of our democracy. But it's important to distinguish between debating the evidence and rejecting the scientific process. I've now had the privilege to lead CSIRO for just over a year, and in that time I've realised the importance of our role as the National Science Agency in bringing impartial and carefully considered research, evidence and data to inform our community and government about the challenges ahead. If we're to overcome these profound challenges confronting us, Australia needs a strong and vibrant National Science Agency. That's why we've begun work reshaping CSIRO to ensure we can continue to effectively solve the challenges that matter to Australia and Australians. 1 year into the role, I'm honoured to share some of the highlights and celebrate the work of our many dedicated scientists, researchers, engineers, technologists and economists. Last month we hosted His Majesty King Charles III at our National Bushfire Behaviour Research Laboratory to learn about how CSIRO scientists working collaboratively with organisations across the country help us understand and predict bushfire behaviour, as well as help protect communities and fire crews during outbreaks. Our scientists have been working to reduce the impact of fire on Australia's people, environment and economy for more than 70 years. We're also working to protect Australians and Australia's valuable livestock and aquaculture industries from emerging infectious disease threats like bird flu, and I'd like to add that the ACDP facility in Geelong is an absolute national treasure in that regard. This high biocontainment facility in Geelong gives Australia sovereign capability to quickly control disease outbreaks, to keep control of trade-sensitive information and to conduct its own investigations into potential biothreats to the nation. Our team at ACDP has provided confirmatory testing, expert scientific advice to government and animal health working groups involved in the response to recent bird flu outbreaks in Victoria, New South Wales and ACT. I'm inspired daily by the passion and commitment of the people at CSIRO and our collaborators. I'm also deeply grateful to the Australian community and our elected representatives for their continued support and confidence in our work. And as I said in my first opening statement at Estimates, leading the CSIRO is an incredible privilege and the best job in the world. 12 months on, it remains so.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr Hilton. We'll go straight to questions, and I'll go to Senator David Pocock.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your time and for waiting around for the Senate. I have some questions about the CSIRO submission to the Chubb review.
Senator Peter Mayfield, Executive Director for Environment and Energy Resources. Happy to answer those.
Thank you very much. Got some questions in particular into sort of the HR carbon credit method, and I've received various documents under FOI and through an OPD in the Senate. And I'd like to go through a timeline of what happened from these documents. On the 5th of October 2022, in the morning, the CSIRO submission stated, "The integrity of HIR-based ACCUs is highly dependent on context. We should work on making this point clear." In the afternoon, a CER executive sent an email to a CSIRO representative that said, "I just tried to reach you by phone. Can you give me a call?" Later in the afternoon, the same CER executive sent another email to a CSIRO executive requesting a phone call to, quote, "to discuss a fairly urgent matter re the ERF methods/accuse. And so just to confirm, a CER executive contacted the CSIRO in relation to the submission. Is that correct?
Yes, they did reach out to CSIRO, which is fairly normal. We get a lot of inquiries about different things.
Earlier this week, in response to questions from Senator Sharma, the Clean Energy Regulator confirmed repeatedly that it was a representative of the CSIRO who initially contacted the Clean Energy Regulator in relation to the submission, not the other way around. I take it that that's not correct in your view.
There's probably multiple connections. So
Well,
I think the one you're referring to
one
in
can be
yours
true, though.
really relates to one that came to my office, and that was around CSIRO submission, and our response was that we would be making a submission and that they would be able to see it once it was been done and put up on the public website, which is how we approach that. There is ongoing work that's getting done in that area, so it's possible that we've had some of our researchers talking on technical issues, but not about the submission per se.
Sure. So who contacted who first? You said earlier that the CER contacted CSIRO. They're saying
So with respect to my office, the contact came from the CER to my office, and then I don't remember which day it was, but it was a bit of a gap before I did contact back, just to let them know that we were making a submission, but we didn't provide any insight into what that submission would have. That was done through the normal process where we put it through into the inquiry, and then they post it on a website. So that's how we've approached it.
Sure. So the CER's evidence is misleading.
I didn't hear the CER's evidence.
I just put it to you.
So I'll tell you about my experience in terms of what's happened in our office. But as I said before, there are ongoing contacts in all the work that we do around HIR and things like that, where we're having technical discussions.
No, I
in the
understand.
background, but not necessarily about the submission.
Sure. This is sort of about executive contact. And getting back to the timeline, the following day, on the 6th of October 2022, the CER executive sent a text message to someone at CSIRO asking to speak about the submission, which, according to internal CSIRO emails, was about CER concerns about the submission and its treatment of HIR methodologies. That's correct, isn't it?
So that would be the contact that came to my office, I believe. Yeah. And as I said before, we didn't actually have a discussion on what we were submitting, just that we were putting a submission in. And we've gone through our normal process, which we do every time. So we pull together our own submission, we edit that, we review that internally, and then we make it available to the committee or the inquiry, and then let the process take its way forward. So it's an independent submission.
So why internal CSIRO emails saying that it was regarding CER concerns about the treatment of HR methodologies, and you're trying to fob it off as just clarifying that you were putting a submission in? That seems two very different things.
In terms of how the actual request was made, I don't know. But in terms of the response that we made, that's the context in which it was made.
I'm not following here. So there's FOI documents of CSIRO saying that CER has contacted us with concerns about HR methodology, and despite that, you're just saying, no, all I chatted about was that we are making a submission.
So to try and clarify it for you, Senator, so we get lots of inquiries. If someone makes an inquiry,
this is pretty
about
extraordinary to have someone who has an independent review of them reaching out to someone who's making a submission to an independent review.
So I won't comment on that, but what I can comment on, when we get an inquiry like that, we sort of take the position of being independent, and we go through our normal process. So my response in that case is about maintaining that independence,
Sure.
and that's how we've responded. It doesn't matter what they've asked, but that's how we respond.
Okay.
That was what I was also going to say. It doesn't matter. We can't control what is asked of us, but what we can control is that we play a dead straight bat.
Sure.
And
I appreciate that.
That's I think the absolute nature of how Dr Mayfield responded to that query.
I appreciate that, but I'll hopefully get to that. But did they ask about the treatment of HIR methodologies in the CSIRO submission?
In the phone call I had, it didn't come up in the conversation. I just made our position clear. So I made that contact, and they waited till our submission went into the inquiry, and they saw it after it had been submitted.
Okay. So they didn't raise any concerns about the way that your submission was treating HIR?
Not with me, no.
No. Who did they raise that concern with then?
I don't know.
Maybe on
the
notice.
Context of that. I'm not aware of that.
You're the boss here, though. It may be on notice if you could find that out, because the day after, on the 7th of October, there was an updated version of the submission described internally by the CSIRO as a now truncated version, and then a further conversation between the CSIRO executive and the CSIRO and the CER executive. Is that correct?
So any truncation that's going on is part of our normal editing process. So I don't think the two are related.
So there was no further conversation after that with the CER?
No, I didn't have any other conversations.
Who did then? Because these FOI docs show that there was a further conversation.
I'd have to look at those, Senator, but from our understanding, we've gone through a normal editing process. We've maintained the independence of what we do. We've made our submission. We haven't discussed our submission with the CER. So, whatever they've asked comes to my office, but it's a request. But we haven't complied with that request because we've maintained independence.
What was that request?
You've actually said it before in your earlier statements. So they wanted to talk about our submission, and the reply I've given is that we're pulling in a submission, and they'll be able to see it once it's been put up on the website.
Okay. Professor Chubb described the submission that the CSIRO made as, to quote him, quite brief. Why was it so brief?
So with most of our submissions, we try to look at the terms of reference, work out where the relevant science is. We like to work with short, clear messages. We also like to work with information that's published.
Sure.
So we sort of draw it back to that. We don't make long submissions typically.
I mean, you are the nation's chief science body, and this is a huge area of not just our national sort of climate change policy, but of interest. And so it really strikes me as odd that the CSIRO is the one who puts in a submission that is quite brief. And
so in terms of those processes, we will typically highlight where we have relevant science and relevant work to the inquiry. Normally there will be a subsequent inquiry hearing that we will be invited to go to, and there's an opportunity for questions and answers at that point in time. And in this case, we did go to the inquiry subsequently, or at least some of our officers did, and that's the way we normally approach it, rather than put in information that may not be relevant to the terms of reference. So
HIR was very relevant to the terms of reference, and so I'm interested if significant parts were removed after concerns were raised by the CER about the part that they were most concerned about.
No, we go through a fairly standard process. We edit based on what we believe is appropriate for the terms of reference. It's not influenced by any outside influences, so very comfortable that we've gone through our normal process.
Okay, so just so I'm clear, what you're telling me is that you had a full and lengthy submission being drafted that had quite a bit to do with HIR. Then you were contacted by the CER about concerns that the CER had, and then just by chance it was cut down significantly and big sections to do with HR were removed from your submission. Is that what you're telling me?
No, I'm not saying that at all. So when we were contacted, obviously my office got a topic they wanted to talk about. We didn't have that discussion around the content of it. We went through our normal editing process as we start with a lot of information, we pull it from all of our scientists, and then we bring it down, edit it down to what's really relevant, what's been published, and shape the submission as to what CSIRO wants to submit. It's not the other, you're making a connection there which hasn't happened.
Sure. And that editing process is something that happens all the time with the number of scientists we have with relevant expertise. We often seek input from a lot of different sources, and that input is then distilled down into something that makes a more salient submission. So
Sure.
that process of going from a longer document with a lot of information to something that is briefer to the point is a very normal part of the scientific process and report writing and submission.
Dr. Hilton, I'm curious that you're not at all, you don't seem concerned about this, that there's an independent review into the Clean Energy Regulator. CSIRO is asked to make a submission. The Clean Energy Regulator contacts CSIRO. They're clearly worried about HIR. And within the space of 2 days, I understand it's an iterative process and things get removed, but the very bit that the CER is the most concerned about all of a sudden is removed from CSIRO's submission.
So we can't obviously prevent people from contacting us, but what we can do is to play, as I said, a dead straight bat in terms of how we internally edit and distill the data we have. And I have full confidence in Dr. Mayfield and his team that he did that in this case, and that the material that was presented was, in CSIRO's view, the material that was peer-reviewed, that was expert and would be of most use to the committee.
Yeah.
Dr.
Senator, if I
Mayfield,
could clarify, so some of the work that I think you're referring to that was removed, that was not published, so it hadn't been through peer review. That has subsequently been published and is now out there and available. But following our approach, which is work with the peer-reviewed information that we put into the submission, that would have been the driving force for removing that. I think the timing is not relevant.
Dr. Mayfield, in response to questions from the media, from what you've just said, the submission was not shared with the CER prior to its publication in any way. Is that correct?
So, just clarify. So we made this is the inquiry submission, went in without the CER seeing that.
Ever seeing it?
Yeah.
Why then was the CER executive so intent on speaking to you 2 days before you were due to make your submission if they supposedly didn't know that you...
I think that's pretty speculative, and I think that's probably a question
It's in the FOI.
For that, I don't think CSIRO can speak to the intent of somebody contacting the organisation. I think that would be speculative.
Pocock, appreciate that you have a line of questions and you can ask your questions, but I also note that you've asked a similar question in different ways and got pretty much the same answer 4 or 5 times, and there are rules and guidelines about sort of repetition in questions, but you have the call to continue.
An internal CSIRO email sent after that phone call with the Clean Energy Regulator, executive stated, and I'll quote again, "We need to actively manage this issue, including putting mechanisms in place for more senior level visibility and oversight in this relationship." I'm interested what was meant by that and what's occurred since then, what has been put in place.
I'd have to look at the specific context of that, but ultimately, when we're dealing with sensitive issues, we just need to make sure we're dealing with them in the right context, with the right level of probity. And I think that's what we have done in this exercise.
So, Dr. Hilton, as far as you're concerned, there's nothing to see here, despite the FOI, despite the ongoing integrity issues with HIR in particular.
Certainly from our viewpoint, I have full confidence in the way Dr. Mayfield's handled that query, and that he has played a straight bat, and that the report that was put in, the public can have confidence in. The submission that...
Is that based on a review or just what you've heard today?
That's based on having discussions with Dr. Mayfield about the issue as it's appeared in the media and has been discussed.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I'll share the call.
Sure.
Yep. So a number of senators have questions now, so I'll give you a call when it's time to ask the last question. I'll go to you, Senator Rennick, if you're ready. Senator Rennick.
Yeah, hi guys, how you going?
Good, Senator.
Yeah, good. Mr Mayfield, maybe my questions, or Mr Graham, might be for you. I'm just trying to track where we're going in terms of costs to get to 82% of renewables in the grid by 2030. Have we got what's the latest forecast for the cost of getting the grid to 82% renewables?
So just to make sure we understand the question correctly, Senator. So when you say the cost of getting to 82%, are you talking about a scenario?
Well, isn't that Labor's target to get to the grid to be 82% of renewables by 2030?
So I believe that's a policy, but in terms of the sort of work that CSIRO's done, so if you're referring to Gen Cost, Gen Cost looks at capital costs for different technologies. It looks at levelised cost of electricity. It's not necessarily looking at pathways to certain percentages of particular energy types or generation types.
Okay, sure. So, Mr Graham, haven't you done a couple of estimates to get to net zero overall? One was originally $1 trillion and it came back to $500 billion to get to net zero?
Paul Graham, Chief Economist for the CSIRO Energy Business Unit. We've done a number of modelling exercises over the years where you can calculate the total new investment to get to different emission targets in the electricity sector. None of the numbers mean anything out of context. The context depends on how much electricity do you need. So, for example, you could have an extremely expensive scenario which is to do with electrifying huge parts of industry, and that could look like a really expensive scenario, but it's actually not necessarily expensive on a unit cost basis. Equally, you could have a $1 trillion scenario where you've electrified a lot of sectors, and then you could have one that's only $500 million to get to net zero, but that could just be that you've got lower electricity demand. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily, on a unit cost basis, lower cost or high cost. So none of these numbers about the investment cost over time mean anything without context.
Okay, so the context is that both major parties have committed to getting to net zero by 2050. What does the CSIRO forecast the capital cost will be to reach that target?
Senator, to answer a question like that, we'd need a lot more information about the underlying assumptions of that scenario. So what's happening globally, how else are we treating emission abatement in other sectors of the economy, which might affect the amount of electricity demand. So I can't answer that.
Okay, no, and that's a fair point, but I guess the headline slogan that people get is that we're going to get to net zero by 2050. So I would have thought that we owe them, a detailed estimate of the cost to get there by 2050, and all those assumptions, obviously someone along the line has advised Prime Minister Morrison, or former Prime Minister Morrison, back in 2021, I think it was, when he signed it up to net zero, what the implications would be by signing up to net zero. So surely by now, this is a couple of years old, this agreement, we've sat down and worked out what assumptions, what's going to have to happen in order to reach net zero, and someone somewhere has had to model those costs, including the capex costs of, getting the grid and whatever else.
So, Senator, I believe there's a range of different exercises that are looked at that, but they're not electricity system only.
No, I accept that.
They're much bigger analyses, and they're viewed as pathways based on various scenarios. So some of that work.
But you're the scientist, and you also do the capex costing. What are the pathways? So, would you want to explain to the Australian taxpayer what exactly, and the Australian energy consumer, what are the pathways? What sacrifices are they going to have to make to get to net zero by 2050?
And you'd be aware of some of the recent work around sectoral plans that the CCA has been working on and things like that. So it's that sort of analysis. It finds a pathway to get the emissions down. It's not necessarily fully costed at the stage. There's economic analysis that goes with it as well. But
Yeah,
that's,
no, I
that's
accept
not
that.
CSIRO on its own. That's a range of groups.
I don't think that's a question that CSIRO can answer in isolation. I think there are a number of policy issues that those costings would be dependent on. We're not in a position to make those calls, and nor are we in a position to do that work alone.
No, that's fair
So
enough. but
I
that's
feel
what
like
I'm
it's not a
asking you.
question we can really answer, Senator.
But, well, I would have thought you could answer a large part of that because through the CapEx and the actual science. So if we're not going, so let's say we get to 82% renewables in the grid, what other sectors are going to have to reduce their emissions, and how will that happen to get to net zero? So we can split this into two questions now. So let's put the economic costing aside. What are the pathways to get to net zero by 2050?
So obviously, electrification is a big part of most of the pathways.
So let's take, for example, if we get to 82% renewables of the grid, electricity grid by 2030, what other sectors, so how much will that reduce emissions by?
I can't answer that off the top of my head, Senator, but we can look at that. But electrifying, you've got to look at each of the sectors. So if you're looking at transport, you have to find ways, do part electrification through EVs.
Yep.
You might do some hydrogen. You might do some e-fuels through hydrogen, building up other sort of hydrocarbons that have renewable carbon in them.
And when you
so
say,
you've got to look at each of these. You've got the land use sector as well, land use forestation.
Yep.
So you've got to make a decision on how much carbon abatement you might get from that. You've got to look at things like CCUS. How much would you get from that pathway? But you'll have to look at a range of different scenarios.
No, that's right. So let's take transport, for example. When you say you've got electrified transport, can you be more specific? So we can do some on electric cars. So what percentage of the fleet would have to become electric for the transport sector to, contribute its fair share to reducing carbon emissions?
It's a fairly open-ended question, so it might be better if we can provide you with some materials that relate to some of the existing other work around carbon pathways.
Okay, and I accept, there's obviously going to be a lot of scenarios, and I accept there's other departments,
Yeah.
but would you accept the CSIRO, being the chief scientific agency, is going to have provide a lot of input into this?
Yeah, we have a lot of the relevant models, and we make them available and contribute. But other groups also are part of that as well. So, and I guess some of the work that we just referred to before that's happening through the CCA, we've been contributing to that. But that's much bigger than CSIRO.
Sure. So I just want to narrow down a couple of things. So with that transport
Last
sector,
question, Senator Rennie.
yeah, with the transport sector, is it just electrification of passenger vehicles, passenger vehicles, or is it?
Well, if you think of transport, it's road, it's rail, it's air, it's sea.
Yeah.
Each of those segments will need a different solution or range of solutions, because I think our ongoing sort of view is that there is no one solution that solves each part of the problem. You're going to have to use a multitude of solutions. If you're looking at air, we do work with Boeing. We're looking at everything from Boeing's looking at using batteries in planes. They're using hydrogen in planes.
I've got that one.
And they're also looking at e-fuels. So
there's no clear pathway yet to 2050.
Recyclable carbon. So there's a multitude of solutions there. Rail can be electrified. We also got some people trying battery electric locomotives. So there's a range of solutions being trialled there. If you look at vehicles, you can have electric vehicles. I think for short range, it's pretty clear. For heavier transport or longer range, it may not be the right solution. That's still up for debate. But then you're looking at things like hydrogen-fueled vehicles, potentially, or again, other e-fuels that you might be able to create. So each one has a different solution.
Thanks,
Senator Rennie. Thanks, Dr Mayfield. I've got a lot of senators on my list now. Senator Roberts.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for being here again. Good to see you, Dr Hilton. My questions are fairly short. CSIRO didn't give a direct answer to my question on notice about the cost of Pioneer Burdick and pumped hydro, but I have the latest figure the CSIRO was using for the Pioneer Burdick and pumped hydro in Queensland, $12 billion. We now know the Queensland Government internally had the actual cost at $36 billion. Triple. Snowy 2 has blown out from $2 billion to $20 billion, and I forecast that in 2017. That's if you include the connecting infrastructure, everything to turn the power on. Why do you continue to tell Australians this is a cheap pathway to follow when every step we take proves you wrong, repeatedly wrong? Why?
So, Senator, these numbers are sort of embedded in our Gen Cost report, and with every technology, we're looking for, I guess, actual projects to base our numbers on. I don't believe we've been using the numbers for the Queensland project as part of that. Ms Graham can probably clarify that for me, but we update that on each cycle based on what's actually happening out there. The numbers are as up-to-date as they possibly can as get more project information.
So that worries me more they're up-to-date. Your Gen Cost is nothing more than a fairy tale. Considering the assumptions, when we include then all of the additional costs like pumped hydro that are needed to make it work in Australia, it's not going to have a cheaper energy system, are we, under Gen Cost?
So, Chair, could I just object to the use of fairy tale? I think that's a pretty derogatory way of describing what is a well-considered report that has opened itself up to input from a large range of experts over an 8-year period, and I think provides excellent guidance to the community about the levelised cost of energy.
As I said, when we go into the assumptions,
you've put that,
it's fairy tale.
Senator Roberts. Senator Roberts.
Yeah, can I just make a couple of comments about this? I mean,
assumptions have been proven wrong repeatedly.
Senator Roberts.
It's the kind of badgering of our key national scientific organisation that you should not do. You should not do. It's an organisation that has served Australia well for decade after decade after decade. It is composed of scientists and staff who work diligently on these questions. It is, of course, open to people, particularly people who've got some peer-reviewed scientific background, but it's open to people to ask questions and to criticise the findings of the CSIRO and any other research institution. I don't mind the scrutiny. I don't think it does your cause any good when you ask these questions, but I don't mind it. Okay. What I do mind is the use of derogatory language. The problem is it's not just a one-nation senator who does it. We sort of expect that. It's the Leader of the Opposition who said, on Gen Cost, it's a discredited report, let's be clear about it, it's not relied on, it's not a genuine piece of work.
Correct.
Like what is wrong with the Liberal and National Party that you allow a bloke to run the show who pours scorn.
Chair, this is taking up my time.
Who pours scorn on science and engineering.
All right.
It has got
You're just taking up my time to shut me
All
up.
right.
But you're the one who applies the derogatory comments.
Minister.
It's got to stop.
It's my opinion.
It's got to stop.
Minister.
It's got to stop.
Okay. Senator Roberts, can I just have a conversation with you?
Sure.
You still have the call. You've asked a question in a certain way. Dr Hilton's put some comments on the record about that. The Minister's put some comments on the record about that. My job is just to make sure that you ask your questions in a courteous way. And you can ask questions about Gen Cost. I just ask that you put them in a courteous way.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. Can you guarantee the entire electricity system, from generation to poles and wires to the electricity bill to the cost of taxpayers, is going to be cheaper if we continue down your pathway? The Renewable Energy Electricity Act was passed in the year 2000 under the Howard LNP government. So for more than 20 years, government has forced an increasing amount of wind and solar onto the electricity grid. This is a graph of the cost of electricity over the past 20 years. It has tripled, largely under your guidance. Can any one of you experts here please tell me in which year on this graph putting more wind and solar on the grid has brought down the price of electricity.
So,
I'm happy to table this. I'm happy to table this.
Thank you, Senator Roberts.
So, Senator, we don't have a pathway. We provide data to our elected representatives for them to make policy decisions about our electricity system. We'll continue to do that through the Gen Cost report in a manner that is objective and that is open to feedback with each iteration of the report as it's been over the last 8 years. And it's up to our elected representatives to make the policy decisions about pathways as they've done over the last 30 years, as you showed in your graph.
So you can't guarantee a pathway?
Well,
But we don't-
Are you aware?
It's not up to Mr Hilton.
CSIRO's
or the
advises three
CSIRO
pathways, Senator.
They don't
Three
run
pathways.
the energy strategy of the Commonwealth or the states. They provide expert advice on what the cheapest technologies are in the Australian context. That's what they do. They are scientists. They provide advice. It's a matter for government to follow. It's not their pathway. The government takes advice about, and the private sector too, takes advice about what the cheapest forms of technology are. And if you persist in supporting the most expensive ones, that's a matter for you.
Okay, thank you, Minister.
Let's take the word of the RBA Governor this morning. She said the key factor is supply and demand. When you add electrification to this, what the hell are we going to do to prices? Are you aware that higher electricity prices cascade and multiply throughout the economy, devastating manufacturing, devastating agriculture, devastating household bills when you remove the subsidies? Every nation, are you aware that every nation in the world increasing solar and wind increases electricity prices? The real-world data shows that. And within you, does this fact about increasing solar and wind driving increasing electricity prices in many nations, in every nation across the country, across the globe, within you, does this fact raise any questions? And if so, what questions?
Senator Roberts,
I'm asking.
Yeah, well, I'm answering. I'm answering. If you'd approached this issue in a straightforward way, you would have explained that the graph that you waved around is the electricity CPI. Right? It's not the real. It's not the real cost over time. It's got inflation built into it. If you were straightforward about it, you would pose the counterfactual. What happens if you put more expensive than the...
I just told you what happens, Senator.
Well,
around the world, every nation that increases solar and wind increases electricity prices.
Well, that's what Australia has to confront is the... there's our colleagues in the House of Reps going home.
After passing the misinformation, disinformation bill.
What the government has to do, serious government, actually interested in the future of manufacturing, we will need more electricity, Senator Roberts.
The most important factor in manufacturing
because we're going to build
is electricity.
We're going to build more
and you're
manufacturing,
driving the price up,
and we're going to drive the price down by delivering more supply and a modern generation facility. Now,
when you add the demand,
you can hold up your silly graph as long as you want,
right.
but it doesn't alter those facts.
Okay, I'm about to.
One more question, Chair.
Hello, everyone. I'm about to share the call, but I take Senator Roberts' point that we've also had some long answers. So, Senator Roberts,
last question.
Thank you. Ask your final question.
Thank you, Chair. The federal government says it relies on the CSIRO for advice on energy and future climate. Do you take responsibility for destroying Australia's position as the cheapest supplier of electricity in the world to now being among the most expensive and hurting people and industries, while Mr Mayfield, during a cost of living crisis 2 years ago, was on a total remuneration package of more than $613,000? I'm thinking of people with a median income of $51,000, and half the Australian population is earning below $51,000.
Senator, I'm always impressed with the quality and influence of the work that our scientists do, but their capacity to directly alter cost of living for Australians, I think, is not one of those gifts our researchers have.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Hilton.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I'm going to use Senator Cox online. Senator Cox.
Chair, can I ask some questions in relation to the National Emissions Monitoring Roadmap?
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. I think that would be one initially for Dr Mayfield.
I can try and answer those for you, Senator.
And if we can't, we will, of course, take them on notice and answer them with the appropriate scientific input.
Great, thank you. The proposal that's been put forward by the Superpower Institute includes authors that were also from CSIRO. It talks about the roadmap intending for government to invest in the capability to accurately facilitate and inventory emissions data. This is really civil society trying to move ahead with measurement. Is CSIRO currently undertaking any work in relation to this?
So, Senator, with regard to emissions, so obviously we have a couple of facilities around the country. So we have our Cape Groom facility, Kananook, where we measure a range of gas concentrations, CO2 obviously being one of those, and methane. We have also done work over the years in the Surat, looking at emissions in the gas fields there. We do measurements in Melbourne. So we have expertise in those areas, and that's ongoing. In terms of the roadmap that we're referring to, an inventory measurement, that's done more through, at least the inventory calculations are done through DQ. We don't do those, but we do the science on how you can do some of the measurements.
Thank you, Dr Mayfield. I do know of the 4 monitoring sites, Cape Grim in Tasmania, Gunpoint in the Northern Territory,
yep,
Aspendale in Victoria and Wollongong in New South Wales. And I also know that the emissions, the National Emissions Monitoring Roadmap actually recommends 16 sites, and that we also have some very clear and very good satellite data that's going to show us even before we start reporting the emissions that are currently out there. In fact, it's been reported that internationally other countries know exactly what our emissions are because we're actually not reporting, we're not measuring to the degree that we should be, and we're actually relying on industry to do that reporting. And from coal mines right through to gas fields, it's been reported that they're actually under-reporting. So if we're not measuring it, we're not managing it. Is that correct, Dr Mayfield?
So in terms of the inventory sort of measurement, as you say, it's done through reporting by industry and other mechanisms, and that's done through DQ. And I would refer to them if you want to talk about the existing methodologies. In terms of alternative methodologies, CSIRO has looked at some of those at different times, but I would argue that there's still, you require some development, because it's not about measuring concentration, it's about measuring fluxes. So if you don't do the right type of measurement, then you can't actually quantify what the emissions are. So doing satellite measurements at the moment will give you concentration, but it won't necessarily give you flux. So there would have to be science done to enable that. We have done that on a small scale. So you might be familiar with the Arcturus towers that we had up in the Surat. We're using a couple of point source measurements trying to then infer a flux from that. So we do have expertise where we've tried to do that in the past, but that would have to be refined and developed.
Well, Mr Mayfield, can I give you an example? I'm here sitting in WA, and what I know is that in 2022, Chevron released 16 million tonnes of greenhouse gases, including methane, into the air from the Gorgon project here in Western Australia. And that company said that it wouldn't actually do that amount of emissions during the approval process. I mean, what is stopping and encouraging us to talk about green steel and hydrogen production and actually, making a much more inroads into using science to, make sure the data reflects the important emission targets that we've now legislated here, but also that for $40 million, I think it's pretty cheap as a start-up that the government could actually contribute much more to that, and $6 million in the forward estimates. And I don't know if the Minister wants to provide any more information, but I believe that if the government, using the amazing scientists that you have at CSIRO, but also our international partners to learn from, we are going to see data being shared more openly, which we could get in front of if we actually make the investments.
Senator Cox, I'm delighted that you asked because I was going to intervene anyway. Just made me seem more polite. The truth is that these questions were agitated in energy in DQ estimates the other day. I know that because I was there. It's not something that the officials can really answer. Australia does. I can tell you, though, that Australia, along with 150 other countries, has signed up to the Global Methane Pledge. That does mean that while our overall approach to emissions is governed by the broader emissions targets that we've signed up to, we are aware as a government, and the other participants in that Global Methane Pledge are aware that in the short run, the impact of methane emissions is something that we ought to be paying attention to. There is, as I'm aware, some work going on on the measurement side, no doubt supported by the CSIRO. Those hydrogen projects that you talk about are very important for a low emissions green iron and green steel and green minerals processing for Australia. The thing that you might not like, but is the truth, is that all of those projects require gas at the first instance. You don't get to green hydrogen except through gas, is the truth. And if we want the world to move to green hydrogen, the truth is that in manufacturing terms, that is going to require some gas as we accelerate the amount of hydrogen that those projects can take and that we can produce. But I really reckon further questions on methane emissions probably should be directed towards DQ unless there's something on the technologies themselves that the officials can answer.
So, Minister, do electrolysers use gas?
No, in production processes that I've seen, no, electrolysers don't require gas.
They can make green hydrogen, though.
If you are heating iron ore to turn it into, in the volumes that are required to change the dial in steel, you can do very small volumes, but if we're going to make big progress, that's going to require a transition from one form of technology to another, and that's just the fact of it.
Senator Cox, you've got a couple of minutes left there, so if you want to conclude your questions.
Thank you, Chair. The other question I have is in relation to a recent survey regarding public attitudes towards mining in Australia. What were some of the most interesting findings of that report that was recently released? If members of CSIRO could share.
Yes, Senator. So you're referring to the work that was launched on the 29th of October?
I am. Thank you.
So, and that's the third survey in the series. The previous one's been done in 2014 and 2017. I guess key findings that came across was that there has been an improvement in public trust in the mining industry in the time, but there are some nuances to be worked through. So 73% of respondents acknowledge that access to critical minerals is essential to achieving net zero emissions. 71% agree that mining is important to the Australian way of life. 72% believe that mining will support Australia's future prosperity. And then despite that strong support, 61% agree that mining has negative environmental impacts. 32% of the respondents believe that Australia should reduce mining activity even if it delays the transition to net zero emissions. And the economic contribution of mining and its importance in supporting the energy transition are widely recognised. and then I think ultimately ensuring that actively engaging communities, fair distribution of benefits are key to maintaining industry social licence, with 52% of participants agreeing that mining communities receive a fair share of the benefit. So I think those are some of the highlights. There's obviously more to it than that.
Thank you.
That's what I'll share with you.
Thank you, Senator Cox. I'll share the call and I'll go to Senator Hodgins-May.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for being here. Dr Hilton, CSIRO announced at the start of this year that there would be a restructure earlier with cuts of $100 million to operations. Can you confirm the reason for these cuts for us now, please?
There are a number of different factors that led to us making those changes. They include increasing in operations costs higher than inflation, and we've seen that with ICT and with our property portfolio, but also the ending of the time-limited COVID budget measure.
Thank you. And is it correct that it's around 25% cut to operations, 500 jobs being axed and approximately 200 enterprise services contract term positions at risk?
So we need to make a savings of about 25% in enterprise services, and we have an estimate of the potential affected staff numbers, but we're still consulting, and as you would appreciate, one of the things that we're keen to do is mitigate those potential cuts with other types of operational savings, so it's hard to give you an exact number of potential reductions in staff in enterprise services. If you could hand to Mr Munyard if you have kind of more detailed questions about that.
Yeah, and perhaps not exact numbers, but estimates would be useful. Thank you.
So Tom Munyard, Chief Operating Officer. So Dr Hilton's right, it's about a 25% reduction that we're expecting across our enterprise services, and we are targeting where we can operating cost savings. We have announced that we are expecting a reduction of FTE of around 375 to 500 in our enterprise services, and we're working through that. But as I said, we're trying to focus on some operating cost savings there. We have seen significant increases, as Dr Hilton said, in property. We've seen some contracts increase by around, or costs increase by around 25%. In ICT, around 35% in terms of some of our licensing costs, etc. We are looking at opportunities to reduce and merge the number of platforms that we use in order to make sure that it's operating savings we're able to generate instead of labour. Over the past few years, we've been able to harvest some savings in relation to property, including some years ago being able to vacate off our North Ryde lease, which was around $20 million per annum. We've done ACT consolidation within our ACT sites, such as Yarralumla and Crace, and we're in the final stages of being able to vacate Crace in order to maintain some operating savings there as well. But as I said, the operating costs that we're seeing increase were beyond what we expected to see, and are starting to, and we're looking into those to see if there's further savings that we can make in order to reduce those labour savings.
Sorry, in that response, did you provide an estimate of how many enterprise services contract term positions are being?
So we've announced to staff and that we expect the reduction to be around 375 to 500 FTE in our enterprise services. But as Dr Hilton said, we're still in consultation in relation to that.
Thank you. Dr Hilton, in the last Senate estimates, you told me on the 1st of July that CSIRO has known for a long time that the budget measures during COVID would come to an end and that you would need to adjust your spending, and that no additional requests for funding were made to the government. Dr Hilton, can you provide just a brief timeline of when you found out about the conclusion of the safety net funding provided during the COVID-19 pandemic? The conclusion of the safety net funding provided during COVID-19 pandemic.
I would defer to Mr Munyard.
So that measure that you've referred to was $454 million provided in the October 2020 budget, and it was highlighted at that time that it was a terminating budget measure ending in 23-24.
And so, thank you. And Dr. Hilton, did you find out when you started your role, essentially, that was the predicament, that there was a funding cliff?
Yeah, I think the team was aware, and I was aware coming in as Chief Executive, that there were changes that needed to be made in order to be able to reshape the organisation at the end of that time-limited budget measure.
And that was around October 2023? Was it when you started?
I started on the 29th of September
29th.
2023.
And it would have been soon after that, presumably?
Yep.
I'd like to table the document sent to the Secretariat, please.
I've been given a copy of that, and that the committee tables your document.
Terrific, thank you. CSIRO's 2022-23 annual report, page 144 to 147, shows CSIRO's board members, CEO, management team, senior executive staff and other highly paid staff received over $3 million in benefits and allowances. They, minus the board, also received over $263,900 in salary at-risk payments, which we understand are well known to be bonuses. When you announced to staff CSIRO's $100 million budget cuts, how did you explain that hundreds of jobs would be lost, I suppose, while bonuses of around $260,000 and other benefits and entitlements worth over $3 million were going to the highest paid staff at CSIRO?
So that occurred prior to, you're talking about an annual report that was some years ago, and we would have to go back to our communications, but I would be happy to take that question on notice, Senator.
Thank you. So perhaps if one of your colleagues wants to answer, is that correct? Were bonuses paid to CSIRO's senior leadership while you knew that that funding cliff was ahead and that hundreds of staff were going to be laid off?
So there is only one salary at risk payment that exists now, and that's the Chief Executive's in accordance with the Remuneration Tribunal's assessment of his remuneration arrangements. All other salary at risk or bonus payments, as you referred to them, no longer exist, as far as I'm aware, in CSIRO now.
I'll check that in a moment. Dr. Hilton, as CEO, you were paid a base salary of $588,800 for the 23-24 financial year. Did you receive a bonus payment on commencement of your term in September?
Yeah, I had the same arrangement as through the Remuneration Tribunal, and for the record, I didn't negotiate my contract at all, and would be very happy should the board and the Remuneration Tribunal move my salary to a set salary. I don't.
Thank you. And have you continued to receive any other benefits or allowances or salary at risk payments since your commencement?
I don't believe so. I have a contract that has a base salary and an at-risk component, and that was the one I was offered and didn't negotiate it.
Okay, so that initial payment was the only one that you're aware of when you first started?
I didn't get a sign-on payment.
Okay.
At all. I don't think that would be appropriate. I was privileged to take the job. I didn't require any convincing.
Has the acting CEO received chief bonuses, salary at risk payments?
So in accordance with the Remuneration Tribunal in the last financial year, yes, the acting CEO did, and that's outlined in the financial table that you've tabled into this committee as well. Other benefits and allowances that you're referring to there, Senator, are in relation to items such as a motor vehicle allowance, which is provided to a number of senior executive staff and reasonably consistent across the public service as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask that. So that comes under that $3 million, like that benefits and allowances.
Other benefits and allowances is what that would be classified in the and just to be clear, in relation to my answer earlier, I would like to take on notice the answer in relation to bonuses. It is my my view that, or what I think is that Dr. Hilton is the only one entitled to, but I would like to take that on notice just to double check for you.
Thank you. And perhaps also on notice, I'm just curious, it's a significant amount of money on benefits and allowances, $3 million, at a time when you knew that there was a significant funding cliff that was imminent. Is it possible to get some information around what that was made up of, that $3 million of
Can I just
allowances?
check the figure that you're referring to, Senator?
Remuneration.
I can't see the $3 million. I think what you're talking about is the total remuneration that Dr. Hilton pointed out. I can't see a figure in the document that you've given us that adds up to $3 million for other benefits and allowances.
I think it's 126,412 for other benefits, and a total remuneration.
Yes, sorry, 263,961 of that's salary at risk, other benefits, 550. Yes, sorry. So in terms of the other benefits of 550,914, is that something that there is information available around what those sorts of allowances?
So again, if you can just be exactly clear which columns you're referring
So
to in the table, we'll take that on notice.
Yeah. So I'm looking at the annual report now.
I have table 3.2 on page 144.
Yeah. So salary at risk, $46,000, and in those other benefits and allowance, $130,000.
Yep.
Superannuation, and then I might put that one on notice.
Yeah, that might be helpful.
Yeah,
and if you're at time,
am I?
so
okay, I'll just finish.
just
May I
your last
briefly finish
question?
these questions? Thank you. Data 61 is the globally recognised and award-winning data and digital specialist unit at CSIRO. According to the CPSU, in March 2024, staff were briefed by Data 61 management, who warned that a funding shortfall would result in an operating reduction of up to 20%, which would mean significant job losses. Staff were told that 120 jobs would be cut from Data 61. In estimates on 5th of June this year, you stated that there were no planned staff cuts for Data 61. Later in June, CPSU staff said they were engaged in meetings that were the start of early engagement meetings outlining and asking for feedback on managing announced shortfalls in Data 61 budget, which was in deficit of $1.6 million. These meetings were to address budget deficits and proposed cuts that we were told weren't going to happen. Can you confirm if any jobs are being cut from Data 61, and if so, how many you're expecting?
I can confirm that CSIRO won't make any further changes beyond the ones we discussed, which were in health and biosecurity, ag and food, and I think a few in manufacturing. They were the ones that were planned for last year that I briefed I think I briefed you on the last question at the last estimates hearing. We don't plan to make any further major changes to research, but I would say in this financial year, but we always look to strategically reshape our research portfolio to ensure that we have the capability that we need to address the questions the community expect us to answer, and that does require, over time, some changes. So, but this financial year,
been told that then?
Just one final question.
Yes, final question for now. So, do you know why Data 61 were told that there would be cuts?
I expect the research unit leaders in my teams to be looking at their budget projections and to understand their external revenue, and to be considering plans for ensuring that they balance their budgets. As an organisation, we're going through a major reshaping of our research portfolio. We're putting together different ways that we make investment decisions and prioritise what we do, and it was the organisation's view that it was important to retain our research capability while we did that, and therefore we would find ways of ensuring that there are no additional cuts to research capacity this financial year. I should also say we also recognise that there's a lot going on in the organisation. We're undergoing enterprise service reform, and I think being able to retain our research capability through that process and through our strategic look at how we make investment decisions is the prudent way forward.
Senator Pocock.
Senator Ayres, it really strikes me listening to Dr. Hilton talking about the changes he's having to make and the cuts. that at the same time that we're talking about a future made in Australia, the value of research, you clearly share my love and respect of the CSIRO. We're giving them less money. I'm just interested, what's the government's thinking there, making the CSIRO at this point in time, given the huge challenges we face, make cuts to their research?
Well, as Mr. Hilton's set out,
he's only doing that because he's got a $100 million hole in his budget. I'm sure there's plenty of areas where scientists would love to do more research.
Yes,
so
and
I mentioned the government's view.
You've got a minister who supports science and public science and research and development, but a government that is absolutely behind the CSIRO and our other research institutions more broadly. There has to be budget allocation, as Mr. Hilton set out for you and for Senator Hodgins-May. There was a terminating measure which was to provide additional funding, which I think everybody in the Parliament would have supported, additional funds during that period. That has come to an end, so that is the first set of issues. As I understand it, I've listened carefully to the evidence. The second set of issues, of course, is that the CSIRO's research priorities will shift over time. Right? And my expectation, the government's expectation, is that the CSIRO, that Mr. Hilton and his team will work with the staff and the trade unions that represent them at the CSIRO in an open and careful way. It's gone. I've been watching from a distance. It's gone over the course of several estimates, so that is quite some months as the CSIRO works through those issues. That's our expectation, that the CSIRO manages that process well.
Sure. I'm sure Dr. Hilton would be like to spend his time on doing other things than having to restructure and cut jobs. And I guess my question to the government is, why, when we have in our history a record low research and development spend, when you have scientists and researchers doing more with less, are we happy for the CSIRO to have to cut $100 million? And why are we at a record low in R&D, and the only thing we've seen from the government is a review to potentially look at increasing it?
Well, the CSIRO is part of the public effort in R&D for the country.
And their budget's being cut.
It is part of it. It is, of course, not the only part of the public effort. So that is the states and territories, the Commonwealth, the university sector, the CRCs, all of the architecture that sits there to support publicly funded research. Some of that is more commercially focused, some of it's deep public research. Then, of course, there is the private sector.
But none of them are getting extra money from the government.
Well, I think...
So you're saying they're part of it, but it's not like you're allocating millions of dollars to other research areas. Like we're at rock bottom, 0.5% of GDP.
I think what you'll find is that this government is, in terms of all of those, in terms of the publicly funded component, providing a lot of support, not in the order of millions of dollars, but billions of dollars across the system for the publicly funded component of that research. I want to see, and I think the Minister wants to see, the private sector lift its contribution on those questions as well. The big, I have to say.
Your last question, Senator Pocock.
Yeah. So that's so. Of course, that is. You've heard the Minister out there on these questions in terms of the R&D review. There's a high level of interest in how we focus and amplify public research in the public interest.
I mean, I don't remember a science minister who cares more about science, to be honest. Clearly, Minister Husick cares. You care. This is a question for your government and priorities when it comes to Treasury and the budget. There's a CSIRO report quantifying Australia's return to innovation. It highlights that for every dollar invested in research, Australia receives an estimated return of $3.50, with a 10% average annual return. It seems like a damn good investment.
Yes, and that's
so. When are we going to see Treasury and the government back up Minister Cusack and yourself and the CSIRO?
Well, the government believes, all of us, that we have to maximise the impact of our research and development capability, including the CSIRO. That's why the strategic review of R&D has been undertaken. The truth is that the last time, we are languishing on the proportion of GDP that's contributed.
And that hasn't gone up under your government.
The last time that investment peaked was 2.25% of GDP was when Labor was in government. The truth is, what is required in order to lift GDP is long-term Labor governments that invest in science and research and encourage the private sector to invest. That is the truth. It's not something that's achieved in 5 minutes or 2 years. It's achieved in a sustained way with a government, with prime ministers and ministers who support public research and don't denigrate it like Senator Roberts just did, or the Leader of the Opposition spends his time clowning around, pouring scorn on public science institutions.
Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you, Dr Hilton. Thank you to the representatives from CSIRO.